Hi there, and welcome once again to the Intersex Podcast. I'm Jo Roberts. The title of today's podcast is Mixed Race and Intersex, The Parallels. And as that title suggests, I'm going to be talking about some of the similarities between experiences of mixed race people historically and experiences of intersex people historically. I was inspired to talk about this subject after recently watching a television series called Queen, and this was written by Alex Haley. Now, Queen was made way back in the early 1990s. I think it was in 1993 it was made. And it was made by Alex Haley, who famously wrote Roots. And Roots was a story about mainly slavery. And in writing Roots, Alex Haley traced his lineage all the way back to a slave called Kunta Kinte, who was originally brought over to America from Africa. Queen tells the story of his lineage on his father's side. Roots was about his mother's side. Queen was tracing his lineage back a certain amount of time on his father's side. And the title refers to the main character in it, who is played by Halle Berry. And her mother is a black slave and her father is the white slave master, which was a scenario that was very common during the time of the enslavement of black people. Whilst watching the second part of this show, there were a number of scenarios which it depicted, which very much made me think of the experiences of intersex people. So the character of Queen, although her mother was black, she can actually pass for white. And there are many people during the course of the show who mistake her for a white person. Just to give you a heads up at this point, this podcast will contain spoilers containing that TV show, just in case you're considering watching it. So in the second part, there is a man who visits the flower shop which Halle Berry character Queen is working in, and he is interested in her romantically, and they begin a relationship. However, there are many scenes in which the character of Queen is talking with her friend, who is more or less some kind of escort, and her friend is advising her that she is making a mistake by having a relationship with a white man and not disclosing the fact that she is mixed race, that she had a black mother and that she was a black slave. So this then highlighted the first sort of historical issue, the first historical similarity between mixed race people and intersex people, which was the issue of disclosure. It was very interesting to me to see this because I had never considered that this was a thing before. I don't think it applies nowadays, but it was interesting to observe how it did apply at one point in history, because there obviously was a point in history when mixed race people were expected to disclose this to potential partners just in case that person identified them incorrectly, in inverted commas. Now, those are not my words, that's how some people clearly see it. So there was an issue of angst regarding the possibility that this guy who was having a relationship with Queen might find out that her mother was black and that she was mixed race. It was considered something that she didn't want him to find out, and there was a lot of fear and angst regarding the scenario of him finding out. So this sort of issue of should I disclose, if so, when and how, is kind of one of the things which mixed race people, certainly in past centuries anyway, had in common with intersex people nowadays. I have no idea whether this still applies to mixed race people. I would have to ask one, but I don't really think that it's as applicable nowadays as it was during those times, which was quite a few hundred years ago. But it is interesting because it's exactly what a lot of intersex people struggle with now. When is the right time to tell someone? Do I have to tell someone? Is it a moral issue if I don't tell someone? And the exact same dilemma applied to young mixed race women during the 1800s and 1900s. In the show, the character of Queen engages in subterfuge and she tries to hide it from this guy who she's having a relationship with. But this very quickly backfires, and when he tries to become intimate with her, she is forced into telling him, which then leads on to a very scary and distressing scene in which he lashes out violently towards her and also rapes her as well, and it's a very upsetting scene, and it really highlights the disgust and contempt that a lot of white people at that point in history felt towards not just black people, but even more specifically mixed race people. The disgust in that scene, and I would say also hatred, was very visceral, and it made me think of the disgust which a lot of people have displayed, or either consciously or unconsciously project onto intersex people. In short, our society has a real problem with the idea of nuance. It has a real problem with the idea of something in between. There are even many intersex people who have a problem with the idea of that and negate the idea of that. And in fact, the character of Queen in this TV show refers to herself as Little Miss in between. So that's another parallel between mixed race people historically and intersex people historically. Many intersex people have seen themselves in that light, viewing themselves as something which is perhaps between male and female. But in the same way that there were mixed race people who would be adamant that they were one or the other, there are also intersex people who are adamant that they are one or the other and refuse to recognise this idea of something in between. So it was very interesting seeing that there was another group in history who had had those same experiences, because I had never thought of it in that way before. I think it also applies to some extent to bisexual people as well, so I might talk about that in a future podcast, but it was very interesting to see this because I had never considered that there had been other groups throughout history that had had that same kind of experience of feeling shame and or feeling afraid of the fact that there's something in between these two seeming polarities which society presents us with. Another thing which was very interesting to me was that this show also used the term passing. Now, it was used by Queen and her friend, who was also mixed race, to describe the experience of them passing for white, even though they were mixed race and even though they'd had a parent who was black. So what was interesting about that was I hadn't realised that term, that word passing, had been used in that context before. It's used nowadays to describe somebody who is trying to pass as a particular gender once they've had surgeries and or begin to dress like that gender. It's used a lot in the transgender community, or some transgender people use it. A lot of trans people don't actually like it, but I hadn't actually been aware that term had been used by mixed race people in the past to describe the experience of passing as white. So this was yet another parallel between the groups of people, those who were mixed race in years gone by, and also people who have been considered one thing by the medical profession, gender-wise, but yet identify as another and present themselves as another. This term passing has historically been used by more than just one group, which was not something that I knew before. Next up, and I do find this quite an apt comparison, there was also the issue of acceptance by both sides. So in this show, the character of Queen had difficulty being accepted by white people as a white person, but had difficulty being accepted by black people as a black person. She was exactly the sort of skin colour where you could kind of identify as either, and this was not an issue that I'd spent a lot of time thinking about in life. I had always just assumed, somewhat erroneously, that all mixed race people who have some black in their heritage and some white in their heritage, I had always just assumed that they always identified as black, but that's not the case. And in fact, if I cast my memory back, I've actually known people in real life who were mixed race and who identified as white. So it's very much not the case that all mixed race people identify as black. Some identify as white as well. And this issue in the show of struggling to be accepted by either side is depicted in a few scenes. So there is one scene in which the character of Queen is having a conversation with the mother of the slave master, the plantation owner. And Queen says something to her along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, "My skin is light, how come you can't see me as white?" And the woman responds to her, "Even just a little bit of black and you're not white enough," or something to that effect. And then there is another scene in which there are a bunch of black people whose skin is much darker than the character of Queen's, and they call her a white bitch. And it really highlights this not being accepted by either side dynamic. And there are real life parallels where intersex people are concerned as regarding that issue. I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'll apply it to the specific intersex variation I have, androgen insensitivity, and the real life examples, the real life parallel where this subject is concerned for intersex people is that there are a few feminists, and there are still a few feminists doing this, who have negated the idea that individuals like myself are women. Most famously, Germaine Greer was one such feminist. She referred to partial AIS individuals like myself who are raised as female and identify as female. She referred to us as pantomime dames. And another example of this, of the other side not accepting us as male, would be the male doctors and male surgeons, including the ones who operated on myself, who are absolutely adamant, no, you're female. There is very much a parallel there. Mixed race people in centuries gone by were rejected by both black and white, and there are intersex people alive today whom are rejected as men or women by both sides. And it was kind of mind-blowing to me because I hadn't realised that there was any other group in society having these kind of experiences, or ever had been. I'm not sure if it'll still apply nowadays. I would like to think we live in much more enlightened times now as far as race is concerned, but who knows? If you're watching this and you disagree, then by all means leave a comment and tell me. So I think that concludes this week's podcast. These were just a few of the issues pertaining the parallels between mixed race people and intersex people that I wanted to talk about and was inspired to talk about. Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of the Intersex Podcast. Bye for now.